Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran and former senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And I have been looking forward to speaking with you, as you will soon speak at this national conversation event, which I will leave the information about in the description. But I thought it was interesting to address both the domestic and international issues in a world which is changing. And as the world is changing so fast, it's not a good time to have politics on autopilot, as there is a need to reflect on how the world is changing and how the U.S. should adjust to this, because some, I think, countries will thrive, others will fall, and it depends on the ability to adjust to the world as it is. But yeah, to address this topic, I thought a good place to start would be Trump telling the Europeans now that they have to, if they want United States to put more sanctions on Russia, then they have to go full in. That is, put secondary sanctions on anyone trading with Russia, buying their energy, which means going after China, India. This is, I've heard, different interpretations and perspectives on what the strategy is here. Is this a foolish, delusional approach, or is this some 4D chess we're not understanding?
No, I think that's a great question, because whenever people in the United States listen to something that Donald Trump says that frankly doesn't pass the smell test for common sense, the immediate fallback position is, oh, well, this must be a clever way to extricate the United States from something or put the United States in the driver's seat, so forth. I prefer to listen to the man and go along with what you see, as opposed to what you think he may mean. This message that he said to the Europeans struck me as a sort of a passive-aggressive approach to dealing with international relations that I think is both unhelpful and dangerous. I mean, he starts off by saying, I've decided to, quote-unquote, do sanctions on Russia. It sounded like a valley girl from Central California explaining what she plans to do for the day, and do lunch, do dinner, whatever else. Then he goes on to tell us that, well, I'm going to I'm going to impose sanctions, but everything depends on you in Europe, and I expect that you will follow my lead. Well, he forgets something. You know, George Washington, when he was president of the United States, responded to a question about the French and what they would do in the future and what we might do in the future. And he said, keep something in mind. No nation or no nation state can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. And that was his answer to the question, what will the French do? What will the British do? What will anybody do? And he did not expect anyone to move beyond the limits of their interests in their support of us. In other words, whatever the policy is, it has limitations. And I think as the Europeans read through his message, they're going to come to the conclusion that he wants them to fully commit to national or international suicide by destroying their relations with virtually everybody except the United States and between themselves. And this is not a reasonable solution in today's world. We all live on the same planet. It is in everyone's interest at some point to do business, regardless of the various political systems that each country embraces. So I think the notion that somehow or another the Europeans are going to say, you know, you're right. To be successful in Ukraine, which is, of course, an utterly absurd notion anyway, what we need to do now is cut off relations with China, cut ourselves off virtually from the rest of the world, from India, from everyone else, because all of these states are in one way or another doing business with Russia. You know, Turkey is an excellent example. Turkstream is vitally important to the Turks. They want desperately to have that energy. That energy fuels their industry. They're looking at what has happened in Germany, and they're asking themselves, why would we ever do this? Why would we cut ourselves off from Russia? Do we want to follow Germany down into the hell that Germany has created for itself in this allegedly noble crusade against evil Russia? It's a lot of nonsense. Makes no sense. So I think it's all going to fall apart. And at the same time, of course, we're looking at Europe, and we're seeing all these nationalist parties all over the continent who are effectively coming to power increasingly. That is to say, they're reaching a point in terms of popular support that makes it impossible to keep them from power any longer. And the good news is that the kind of nationalism these states are all espousing has nothing to do with attacking anyone. It has everything to do with what is in the interest of their own country, what's good for their societies. How do they protect themselves, their culture, their identity, their way of life, as well as their economic system? And I think this is the death knell of globalism, frankly. And whether President Trump is playing, as his supporters say, 4D chess, urging everybody to do sanctions the way he is, I have no idea. I rather suspect that some people in his administration are probably thinking in terms of further divorcing certainly Western Europe from Russia and China and other countries. But frankly speaking, I don't see any evidence that that will happen. So I think his plea for everyone else to sanction Russia, sanction China, sanction Turkey, sanction India, and remember, many of the countries that he's determined that we should sanction in one way or another are historic friends, strategic partners of the United States. It doesn't seem to matter anymore. And that's the tragedy of all of this. It goes back to the tariff war that he launched. Suddenly, everyone in the world is treated as the enemy and is subjected to tariffs. There was no discrimination. So again, I fear that he's quite serious and he's going to be monumentally disappointed because I don't think any of it is going to work.
I'm wondering though if you're too optimistic about the Europeans at the moment, because it looks as if Europe has a well, because the times are changing so rapidly, the Europeans have been left in this strategic vacuum that is, they don't really have the ability, it seems, to imagine a world where the collective West does not dominate. So all impulses is to restore the collective hegemony of the 1990s, which isn't achievable. But in the pursuit of this, we now have war with Russia, economic, not just decline, but likely collapse, a political legitimacy crisis, a collapse in international relevance. But there seems the underpinning idea is that if we can just defeat the Russians, then everything could be reversed. We could go back to the 90s, the Russians would be weak and do what they're being told. The US would stay in Europe, so we would have that's kind of our ticket to relevance and prosperity. We would have, in victory, we would also have European unity, and again, the authoritarians would be defeated and liberal democracy would thrive. So this is, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but the groupthink is organized around this, and reason is gone. And with all this madness, you see all the leaders speaking only in slogans and emotional rhetoric. So I don't hear anyone defining what is the objective, how can we achieve this objective. It's just, well, Russia only respects force. Let's push back, and there's no dissent. No dissent is permitted, essentially. So I'm just wondering, it does seem too crazy for the Europeans to agree to something like this. That is, go to economic, cut themselves off from the entire world except for the United States at the time when the US is dictating a bit unfair trade terms to the Europeans. But are you sure that the Europeans won't actually go through with this? Because there's well, our leaders aren't very rational these days, I would say.
Well, you make a valid point that there's a lot of nostalgia, particularly in Great Britain, in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain. I can't really speak about, potentially somewhat in Germany, but certainly the Western European powers that have a history of imperialism and global power and influence are definitely nostalgic for the world that has long since passed. In the United States, there is no such nostalgia. And I would argue that in much of Europe, that nostalgia is giving way to reason and rationality. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're walking around the streets of Paris right now or London, you're seeing something that is far more damaging and far more dangerous to your country than anything that Russia could conceivably ever mount. And what am I talking about? Well, you're seeing your country fall into the hands of recent migrants who are unalterably opposed to your way of life, to your culture, to your religion. They, in turn, are attempting to set up some facsimile of the country from which they came, the society from which they emerged. This is immediate and it's dangerous. Now, the elites, and when I mean elites, I'm talking about the people largely with money, with the ability to insulate themselves from what happens inside their societies. We have them, you have them. They're not terribly concerned, and they view or they criticize their own populations for their lack of tolerance. Well, they're not being knifed in broad daylight. They're not being assaulted, brutalized, or raped. They're not dealing with this sort of in-your-face cultural assault that people in Great Britain and France and Germany are seeing every day. So I think the population doesn't have much tolerance left. The other thing is that I have never seen, and perhaps you have, I don't know, but in my times in Europe, I have seen no appetite for a knockdown, drag-out war with anybody, least of all Russia. And if you mention to most of the people I know in Germany or Austria, certainly in Central East Europe, let's all march east and go into Ukraine to save Ukraine from the Russians, they look at you as though you've lost your mind. They're happy to send untold quantities of money and cash and equipment as long as it doesn't hurt them economically, obviously, and that's about to bite very hard right now. They don't care. They're not interested in that at all. So I think what we have to do is something that I think President Putin has done. President Putin has exercised a great deal of patience. He's being very patient, waiting for this tide of change to sweep over Europe. It's coming. And President Trump's message to the Europeans is going to accelerate that process. The real question is how soon do Americans wake up and recognize that Washington has led them down a blind alley? And that's one of the reasons that I did write the article that I did today about this shift in global power and influence and wealth to the East. It's not because I'm celebrating the demise of the West in any way, shape, or form. And the West doesn't necessarily have to go down as a result of this. But what the West has to recognize is that there are multiple powers in the world today. There are other poles of influence and strength and power. Just because China or India or Iran or any number of other countries and Russia are now powerful actors on the world stage doesn't translate into danger for us. And that's been the problem now, I would say, certainly since 1991. People want to interpret in Washington, D.C., the emergence of other power centers as inevitably damaging to the United States. That's not true. War, as a means of extending power, of imposing your will, is increasingly, I think, obsolete. It's something that doesn't make sense. And I don't see any evidence that the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians or the Japanese or any number of powers out there are turning to the use of military power to achieve their ends. In fact, I think they're all interested in avoiding it. We are the ones that seem to think that military power is a great tool of statecraft. It's not. You could talk to anybody like Ambassador Freeman, anyone who's been a professional diplomat over the last 30 or 40 years will all say the same thing. In statecraft, in international relations, the military instrument is the least attractive because it's the most difficult to control and it's the last choice. And we've been using it and using it and using it. We look at the desert we've created as a result of the use of our military power, we declare victory, and we move on. And the people at home in the United States, they don't sense it because they don't feel the pain. Well, that's beginning to change for reasons of economics, because of the financial system and the dangerous and perilous position we're in. And we're not alone. The Europeans are in a very similar position to us economically and financially. I think all of this is going to come to a halt. But like everything else, when you say that, and you know this, Glenn, from your own experience, people say, well, when is this going to happen? I can't pinpoint the day and time. I'm not Nostradamus. But I think it's pretty obvious that things are going to come to a screeching halt, financially and economically. We can do one of two things. We can jump into a hole and pull the hole down on top of us and hide out and pretend nothing's changed and that we're the greatest. Or we can recognize that the world really has changed. There's a new constellation of powers, and we ought to be part of the new constellation. How do we do that? How do we get into this new constellation of powers? Are we going to sit here in the middle of the Pacific and the Atlantic, thumb our noses at everyone? Or are we going to find a role for ourselves? Instead of looking at the One Belt, One Road program as some sort of fatal danger that has to be combated, insisting that it has purely military utility, which is nonsense, we've got to look at where we fit in. Can we plug into this? Can we offer something? We've got to ask ourselves, what are we going to produce that other people want? What are we going to bring to the table that people respect and are interested in? I think we've got a lot of potential. We seem to have forgotten it. If you go back from the period of world history between 1870 and 1970, everything you enjoy today, from electric lighting to gas heating to automobiles, you name it, all the various vaccinations that do work, these things all have their origins in the United States with brilliant inventions. Well, I think we need to get to work. We need to go to the workbench and start inventing and innovating and get out of this business of trying to figure out how we can bludgeon and bully people to move in whatever direction they want. By the way, there's a great article in the National Interest, and it's by Graham Allison, who makes exactly this point. I think people are figuring this out, but right now, Washington doesn't understand. It's not simply Donald Trump. It's the entire ruling political class.
Yeah, well, let me just say first, I think you're right that something is changing also in Europe, though, that more people are questioning the war propaganda because they realize, well, more people are seeing that the facts that the vast majority of Ukrainians want peace, yet they also see that their own politicians boycott diplomacy and instead give their full support for Zelensky's regime, who's hunting Ukrainians on the street to send them to the front line. I mean, and this is all sold as helping Ukraine. So even as the opposition in Ukraine, the pro-Western one, begins to criticize this, I think more people are waking up that perhaps, governments sometimes lie during wars. But
Sometimes, I think
sometimes,
there's more than just a periodic lying. I think it's become, the stock and trade of too many governments too often.
well, I did read your article though because I thought this is interesting, also in the context of what you said about, you want to preserve the West, and indeed, I think we all share that sentiment. But in order to preserve the West, one have to adjust to reality, and preserving the West can't always only mean that all other centers of powers have to be defeated, because if that's not an achievable outcome, you end up destroying the West with this objective. But the reason I liked your article so much is, I mean, if we take a step back from all these day-to-day issues, we can see the larger changes which hasn't happened in history. That is 500 years of Western power and leadership is coming to an end. And again, finding a new role for the West in the world is quite pivotal, instead of just trying to knock our heads against the wall and get back hegemony. But how are you reading this history, though, the end of this 500-year period?
Well, I don't see it as the end of Western power and influence. I see it as the end of our dominance.
Sorry, that's much better.
The multipolar world is not the end for the United States or anyone in Europe. Quite the contrary. I think it's a huge opportunity. But what we have to do is something that happened over time after 1492. The reason I invoked 1492 is a good friend of mine in Croatia was looking at what was going on in Belgrade and other major capitals and looked at the influx of Chinese investment and so forth. And he just offhandedly said to me, we're beginning to see something that is significant. Maybe this is 1492 all over again. And that triggered the article that I wrote, because I think he's got a point. We're seeing new trade routes, new opportunities, and we're recognizing that other states, other economies have comparative advantages. Every nation state, in my judgment, at some point, has to identify its comparative advantage in certain areas. It has to recognize that in other areas, they don't have a comparative advantage. That's all right. You rectify that situation by economic cooperation through trade and commerce. So that's what we have to sit down and think about. One of the things I also mentioned in that article that we've ignored for a very long time, if you go back 100 years ago, we had probably the world's largest merchant marine fleet. One of the reasons we were able to so rapidly resupply the British overseas, both in World War I and then in World War II, was that we had this enormous merchant fleet. What happened to it? We essentially opted out. Somebody decided that they could make more money by selling it off than they could by maintaining it and exploiting it. Same thing is true with rail. The United States had probably the greatest railroad system in the world. This is especially true after 1870. Once we've had the Civil War behind us, what have we done with it? Perhaps we're all waiting for the aliens to land and to provide us with some new technologies that makes everything we own obsolete. Maybe that'll happen at some point, but right now we're still dealing with the laws of physics. There is a good rationale for the United States that sits in the middle of the world to invest very heavily in fast sea lift and fast high-speed rail. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at Rome and the Roman Empire, the big advantage the Romans had was they sat in the middle of the Mediterranean. And with their legions and fleets and roads and bridges, they could create networks of trade that made Rome wealthy and powerful. Now, nothing ever lasts forever. But my point is we need to look at that example and begin to see ourselves a little differently. Instead of looking at the One Belt, One Road as a danger, can we build fast sea lift that can move goods, say, from Rochefort in France to the east coast of the United States, put them on high-speed rail, and move from there to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Puget Sound and Seattle, Washington, and then from there rapidly to Europe on fast sea lift? Now, I'm saying Europe, Japan and Northeast Asia and China. We also have this Arctic passage that's opened up. There are a lot of reasons for us to look into this. Why? Because we have had historically a tremendous advantage. The advantage is that from Atlantic to Pacific, from Pacific to Atlantic, we speak one language. We have one law. When you move goods from Shanghai all the way up through Central Asia and then down into the Middle East or west towards Europe, how many countries and nation states do you pass through? How expensive is it to move those things? Every one you encounter, and I've got friends that are in China tell me this all the time, as soon as you show up and you're Chinese, say, we want to build a terminal here, we want to put this here, everyone stands there and says, here's my hand, fill it with cash, please. Well, there's no requirement for that. We can move everything from coast to coast without going through multiple countries. We need to think about this. We have refused to think about it. We have refused to invest in it. Instead, where have we spent trillions of dollars? Trillions of dollars intervening in countries and societies that are radically different from ours, in many cases killing hundreds of thousands, displacing millions, destroying economies, distorting regional dynamics, distorting power arrangements in favor of what we think is to our advantage. Well, I've been looking over the last 30 plus years of interventions. I can't find any advantage. I don't see how we strategically have profited dramatically from any of these interventions. Yet that's the underlying assumption in Washington. You intervene in Libya, and what do you get for your trouble? You get chaos. You destroyed the dynamics in the region. Everyone in North Africa is afraid of you. No one really trusts you. If you go into Latin America right now, and we have this armada we're setting up north of Venezuela, everybody looks at Venezuela in isolation from the rest of Latin America. But you can't. Venezuela is part of another continent. If you go into Venezuela, you destroy the power structure in Venezuela. You distort the relations that Venezuela has with its neighbors. You're not just going to end up fighting people in Venezuela. You're going to see paramilitaries from Brazil pour in there to help the Venezuelans fight us. You're going to see the same thing from Colombia. You may see it come in from Peru. In other words, what you think you're doing in one location inevitably has consequences for all the countries around it. We've ignored that. Now, the Middle East is a unique set of circumstances. Every place you go is different. We have to understand that. We've never bothered to look at it from that vantage point. And we have to get out of this business of, once again, seeing military power as the solution that will make us happy, make us rich, make us powerful. It isn't working. It hasn't worked. It's a dead end.
That's the frustrating part as we seek to restore the 1990s. Nobody wants to ask that question, that what was actually achieved since the 1990s. Because, as you said, all of these military adventures, they all led to disaster. And we went from the 90s of unprecedented concentration of power in the West to now this collapse in economic security, political power, as well as the reputation. So and internal stability. So it is strange that no one's looking at a different approach. It is always this same knee-jerk reaction and empty slogans. But what do you see as a different strategy, though? What should the United States be doing now, in your opinion? Again, if
Well, I think
Trump is listening to you, what would you tell him?
Yeah, well, our first step, I say this is particularly true in Asia, and also I would argue to a large extent increasingly in the Middle East. We need to demilitarize our relations with the rest of the world. A good example of the demilitarizing, this man, Lutnick, who works with President Trump, attended a meeting and he sat across from a delegation from India. And the discussion was about commerce and trade. And the Indian leader of the delegation actually asked him, well, what can we do in order to improve our relationship, strengthen our relationship? And Mr. Lutnick said immediately, you can buy more of our military equipment. What? In other words, the only thing that we're producing right now, it's not the only thing because we produce a lot of energy. We're not doing a very good job of it, but we do. We also have a tremendous agrarian sector. And again, I don't think we're getting nearly out of it what we should. But this notion of buy our military equipment is bizarre. You know, this is the one manufacturing sector that we've got that we seem to push very hard. This means that, uh, by definition, you buy our military equipment, then you are allied or partnered with us. Well, India has just demonstrated very clearly that India would like to have good relations with us, but India has its own interests. And those interests involve good relations with Russia and increasingly with China. You know, people in this country, the so-called elites, have been saying, well, India is going to go to war with China. That's inevitable. Really? Why? What are they going to fight over? Are they going to fight over terrain that's 15, 16,000 feet above sea level to adjust boundaries, 5 miles, 10 kilometers? What? It's ridiculous. And why is it in our interest that India and China should go to war? It isn't. The supposition is it's a zero-sum game. In other words, if someone overseas goes to war, we profit. No, we don't. That's ridiculous thinking. In other words, we need to get back to where we were, I would argue, even despite the Cold War and the obvious fears of the Soviet Union, back to where Eisenhower looked at the world and felt that the most important thing we can do is to build prosperity at home. And then he borrowed once again from Washington and Hamilton and tried to export prosperity. You know, this was the other point that was made over and over and over again after our country was founded. People immediately sprung up with the notion that we should invade other places and, quote unquote, spread the revolution. And of course, at the time, Washington and Hamilton in particular, Jefferson was the exception, looked at this and said, well, that's a brilliant idea. Then eventually we'll have the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, the British all landing on our shores to crush us because they will perceive us to be a threat. And Washington made the point that we should be an example to the world. How do you do that? Well, you become prosperous in your own right. then you export that prosperity to others. That's where we've got to get back to. We can be the world's engine of prosperity. That's what we were. That's what made us so popular. A friend of mine was telling me the other day, he was looking back at the Versailles process, and he noted something that I thought was very, very interesting. He said that the Syrian people, in other words, the leaders of the Syrian people, I'm not talking about the French, who ended up dominating Syria after World War I. He was saying that the Syrian representatives to Versailles actually approached the American delegation and said, we don't really want the French or the British or anybody else from Europe in our country. But we all admire the United States. We know that you're fair-minded. You are not interested in conquering other people's countries. Could you come as part of the mandate and help us rule ourselves in Syria? I mean, stop and consider that. Do you think we'd have a delegation from Syria fly to Washington and ask Americans to come and help them rule themselves today? Not likely. So we've destroyed the reputation that we built over 150 years. We're in a very bad position now because people no longer think of us as we would like them to. We are not a beacon of light. We're not the shining city on the hill. And Americans are offended. I talk to Americans, oh, well, what do you mean by that? You sound to me like you're not an America first guy. I said, no, absolutely, I'm an American first person. Absolutely, without question. But they don't understand what we've done to ourselves because to the average American, all of us wear white hats. We're the good guys. And you see, Washington takes advantage of this assumption and proselytizes to the population, well, we're spreading liberal democracy, human rights, freedom. Well, that's all crap, and we know it. That's not what we're about. That's not what we've been doing. So if we demilitarize our relations with the rest of the world and then begin to look at ways to do business with the rest of the world, and I think we can get back to something that was much better than what we have today. Because right now, we are not viewed very positively in the world.
This it often falls under the category of idealist internationalism, how it switches, because you saw the same after the French Revolution. That is, they had it's a liberal revolution talking about the brotherhood of nations. This is going to be perpetual peace. And then suddenly, or very shortly thereafter, the language changed a bit. So, well, we have so much freedom and peace here that we have to bring this peace to other peoples as well. So suddenly it became a civilizing mission. And so the whole liberal revolution ended up then with Napoleon, the emperor, and a perpetual war to achieve this perpetual peace. And you can also put the Bolsheviks in this category. They weren't even supposed to have a foreign policy. They were, after the revolution, they were just going to live in peace, not, just divorce themselves from an aggressive foreign policy. They would oppose empire. But then, just like the French, they had an idea, well, this is such a great peace. We have to bring this to the proletariat of the world. And suddenly, they became an empire too. So this idealism, once it takes on a missionary approach to go out to the world and free other peoples, they still walk with the idea in their head. As you said, they wear the white hats, that they're still the good guy, but they've still taken on the exact same role of the empire. I did want to ask you though, what do you think can be done within the United States? Because I had an interview with Napolitano, Judge Napolitano, which will also be at the national conversation, and he had some very grim views on the future. Though he thought the United States could break apart if they continue down this path. But do you think, for example, third party, something like this is what is required to, I guess, break out of the status quo?
Well, I'm sure that this is a topic that we'll discuss on 4 October in Dallas. And, the Judge Napolitano and I have similar views in some areas, and other areas we don't, which is fine. I mean, one of the things that came up when I was talking to the two guests, Natalie Brunell and Andrew Napolitano, so I said, look, you're not being invited to attend this, and on the basis of your views being identical to mine. That's not the case. They hold views that in many cases are very different. We're not asking people to come there and embrace some set of views. What we want to do is we want to have a conversation, literally. We want to know what others think. We want to know what they want, what they think our interests are, especially at home, because I really believe with the sort of degradation of our economic position, the financial crisis that looms, people are going to be very interested in what we do at home and not terribly interested in what we're doing overseas. So I think the appeal to fear, which has always been the, what's the right word, the card of entry or the ticket of entry into the discussion in Washington. Who are the people we have to be against all the time? That's going away. And people are now beginning to look at the United States and say, what do we want to do with our country? I think that's going to be a big topic. I'm someone who doesn't see us breaking up. I don't think that's likely. In fact, I think whenever I travel across the United States, how many people agree with each other across the country. I don't find deep, deep divisions. Now, if you talk about non-citizens, and we have some 50 million of them, that may be very different, and that's another problem, and that's a problem we have to deal with. But if you look at the body of the electorate, most American citizens, most of the time, tend to agree that we need law and order, that we need safe neighborhoods, that we need a good standard of living, that people should be making more money than they are, that we've got to find a way back to labor that is valuable and productive and can make a good living. We've lost touch with all these sort of basic things that we talked about all the way in the 20s, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You had presidential candidates and they would talk about how much do you earn an hour? What is your dollar worth? What is the buying power? That's why in that article that I wrote, I talk about purchasing power, purchasing power parity, which is a better measure of national strength and health, frankly, than this ludicrous GDP, because everybody adjusts the definition of gross domestic product to suit themselves and so forth. And that's part of our problem here in the United States. We continue to delude ourselves that we are bigger, better, stronger than we really are. We have to come to terms with reality. We are not as strong as we were. Everybody wants to get back to being strong, but they think the route is military. It's not. That's the point. I don't think most Americans want to be drafted into the military and go fight somewhere. But I do think most Americans would strongly support the security of our borders, our harbors, our airports. They would like to see an end to the lawlessness that open borders and unrestricted access to us has created. They would like to see the law enforced. I think those are very, very important things. At the same time, they want jobs. People that don't have jobs want jobs. And I think we could do a better job of producing those. But that's not going to come from continuing down the path that we're on, which is a militarized path. And people look at me, and a friend of mine said, "Gee, Doug, you don't like war and you're a soldier." I don't know very many people that have been to war and seen real combat who came back with an appetite to see more of it. I mean, you do it, it's your duty, but you don't necessarily want to carry that destruction everywhere in the world. And I think people that have never been to war are usually the most enthusiastic about going. So I think we're at an interesting inflection point in the United States. And I think we need to take note of this 1492 analogy, because wealth and power are moving away from us. Instead of saying, well, we need to build more warships, and we need to build forces that can fight further, farther, faster, we need to look at the things that are really the ingredients of success. The key to security is ultimately prosperity, and we need to get back to building that. It used to be a cliche in the United States, especially with the Republican Party. I think it was Calvin Coolidge after World War I would be asked, well, what is the business of America? And he would say the business of America is business. It's not intervention overseas. So, or looking for monsters to slay. Use whatever term, set of terms that you want. I think we can get there. I think that's what the American people want. They don't want chaos, and they don't want to break up the country. So I'm not as alarmist as some others. I think we can get through this, but we need new leadership, fundamentally new leadership.
Yeah, this is something interesting. I also observed that the politicians are the one really foaming at the mouth, who are the harshest warmongers these days, while often you see military leaders asking for restraint. So it's a good point that if this is the people who've seen war who's a bit more cautious, which is also why it's a bit of a concern for me that the whole generation that experienced World War II has passed away, which means that the respect for the horrors of war has also diminished a bit. But it seems that in Europe, though, there's little accountability often for the leadership, because in Germany, when the economy is now doing poor, the leadership saying, well, it's Putin. It's his fault. That's why. When Poland has some social upheaval, people, have the wrong opinion or vote the wrong way. They say, oh, well, it's Putin. He's interfering in society. So it's always, you can always point to this external boogeyman, so you don't have to address your issues. But I guess just as a quick last question, do you see that as being the key problem, that the political elites simply drifted too far away from the people they're supposed to represent?
Oh, I think that's long since happened. I remember Gordon Brown. You'll recall that he was prime minister briefly. And Gordon Brown was surrounded by people. This is someplace in England. I've forgotten the location. And this woman tried to tell him about the danger of this migration. We're losing control of our streets. We're being overwhelmed. And he listened and shook his head. He said, well, we'll deal with that. And as he was getting in the car, he dismissed her comments to a colleague as being racist, got in the car and drove away. Well, Gordon Brown isn't living where that lady lived. Gordon Brown is not exposed to the forces on the streets of London or Manchester or Sheffield or anywhere else that the people that live in those cities who are British are being exposed to, whether they're English or Scottish or Welsh or Irish. They are all coping with these things. Telling them that they're just racists is not a solution. And I think this is the problem at the heart of matters in much of Europe at this point. Any society, regardless of where it is, can always accept a modest number of people into its ranks who are different. And over time, modest numbers can find their way into society. In other words, they can be assimilated. But when you flood countries with millions of people who are absolutely not interested and never will be interested in assimilating, who actually have come there with an entirely different agenda, if not to simply take over your country completely, that's something you're not going to solve by dismissing people's concerns and complaints as being racist. And I think that's a problem today in Germany and the Netherlands and France and many countries. So I think there's going to be an upheaval. And I think the ruling elites that have given attention to anything and everything but their own population and the needs of their own population are going to be held accountable. What that looks like is anybody's guess. But you mentioned the French Revolution, and the French Revolution was an explosion. And that revolution did not spring up from nothing overnight. That was a long time in making. It's just that they reached a point when they could no longer buy bread in Paris that the thing exploded. But the ingredients for the explosion were always there. De Tocqueville, who wrote a marvelous book about the United States, talked about the 1848 revolution. And he was talking about he said, we in France are sleeping on the slopes of a volcano, and no one is paying attention. I think we in the West are sleeping on the slopes of a volcano, and the explosion is coming. But it's not an explosion directed at Russia or China or India or anybody else. It's all directed internally.
Yeah, no, well, for the people who live in Europe now, I think they feel a bit like this, that we're sleeping on a volcano, because the political stability, the idea that there is any, is going away very quickly as you see what's happening in France, Britain, Germany, and you see the media trying to patch things up and sell a narrative which is ridiculous. So
Well, I sincerely hope that if there's anybody in Europe, as well as in the United States, who is still interested, that they will look at the website for 4 October. And if they can come and they can join us, we would be very grateful. We'd like to hear what they had to say.
yeah, and as I said before, I'll leave it in the description for the information about the national conversation, which will take place in Dallas. So thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you, Glenn. Bye-bye.